It's not enough to survive in this racialized world. We are learning together to thrive. This is Race, Health, and Happiness, and I'm your host, Dr. O. My guest today is Paul Taylor. He is an anti-poverty activist and the executive director of FoodShare, Canada's largest food security organization. Each year, FoodShare provides 250,000 people with fresh produce and fights for their right to have access to good food on their own terms. Prior to this work at FoodShare, Paul served as the chair of the BC Poverty Reduction Coalition, also as a board member at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives at the BC office, and was a member of the Raise the Rates BC Steering Committee. Paul presently teaches at Simon Fraser University. Welcome, Paul.
Dr. O, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I'm absolutely honored.
Oh, I love that because I'm honored too. So it's mutual. Yes, thank you so much for joining us on Race, Health, and Happiness. So I'm curious because every guest, I ask the same question. It's my favorite question. What is your superpower?
I'll be honest, I'm not sure that I have a superpower, or even if I want one. They sound like they might be more hassle than they're worth. I think the one thing I really value about myself, I would say, is that I'm curious. I've always wanted to understand why we do the things we do, why we make the decisions that we make, and making sure that I'm also prioritizing time to sit in how things could be different and reflect about how things could be different and how things could be better ultimately. Because I think, curiosity is one of those things that's so underrated, and I think it's really important to all of us because in so many ways, in so many of the systems that we interact with, we're taught to undervalue curiosity and the kind of exploration that goes with it. If I can give one small example, occupational hazard, long answer to a short question. But, one example of how that works is I think formal education in this country is a great example of how that happens. I think in many ways, formal education does a good job of creating obedient workers who fear authority instead of curious people who are willing to push back on injustices, who see and push back, and simply people who revel in the dreams of what's possible. I wish there was more time and space for curiosity, and it need not be a superpower or an exception, but really something we all truly value and benefit from.
Oh my goodness, I love that. I'm going to argue with you and say it is a superpower because a superpower isn't, in my definition, is like your gifts, right? The natural gifts that you have. And as you show your candle in your light of curiosity, then that ignites in the rest of us. And we feel inspired to become curious, right? Wow. So I love that because that's the best way to learn.
It is, we really have to be curious, I think, because that's the only way we will discover new ways of being, new ways of doing, new ways of looking at things, and ultimately ways that serve us better.
I agree. And I will credit you, but I think I'll use that in my courses too and focus on curiosity. I say to my students, I learned this not directly, but through, Angela Davis's work. And when she says as a professor, her work is not about, telling people what to think, but they should be asking questions. If you leave the lecture asking questions, then that is the true, journey of learning. But I like, framing it as curiosity, which sounds even more fun than just questions, right? So thank you for that gift. I like that. Now, in this show, we really focus on racism and how it impacts our health and how to stay, well, despite that. And for many of us, our experiences of racism start at a very young age. And if not racism, then other forms of discrimination or feeling othered. Now, I know for you, you've spoken actually about your childhood growing up in Toronto and experiencing poverty. And so I'm curious about your journey, as a child. Like, what was your experience like in Toronto, and was it flavored by anti-Black racism in different ways?
Interesting question. So I would say, my experiences of food insecurity and poverty in Toronto, as you can imagine, wasn't lovely. It wasn't something that I would wish on anyone. And I think for me, the thing that made it especially difficult, the experiences were bad enough, and I can talk for days about those experiences. But I think, that's a kind of pain. But the real pain was really knowing that it didn't have to be that way. I know that poverty and food insecurity could be eliminated if our governments made it a priority to do so. So, but what I was seeing as a child, and I think what we continue to see, is the exact opposite. We see class warfare, we see a war on the poor. When I was 13, Mike Harris was elected in Ontario, and he, was elected under the guise of this thing called a common sense revolution. Well, I would call it anything but common sense, because ultimately it was a war on the poor. Our family was, my brother and I were raised by a single mom on welfare. And when this government was elected, they decreased welfare by about 22%, which meant we had much less food, much more stress. And ultimately, they did that in the context of also reducing taxes. So for me, it was just so painful, because I was at an age to realize that this wasn't something that just happened to happen to our family. This was ultimately by design, by the people who we entrust and elect to make decisions for the common good. So I think that was the most painful and a key takeaway from my experience for me.
And so I wonder, for you as a child, so prior to 13, did you have a sense in your home that you were like lower income or had less than your other friends? Or the reason I ask that is because I actually grew up lower income, and I didn't realize as a young child that it was abnormal to, walk in the lobby and see glass everywhere on the floor because there had been either a shooting or a fight or whatever. I'm like 5 years old. I didn't realize it was abnormal that there are roaches, all over the place, or on my parents' toothbrush. I never told them. I didn't know it was abnormal. Whoops, because it was my everyday. But I had a number of experiences, and only when I came out of, that situation and met people from different socioeconomic status, then I realized the degree of struggle that my parents had to go through. But were you experiencing as a child in real time with your mom, or experiencing it vicariously through your mom?
Mm-hmm. This is such a great question, and I get asked it a lot, and it really inspires me to kind of think back to some of my experiences as a child. And I would say, there was one thing that's really important that's often, I think, overlooked when we think about poverty, and I think it played such a key role in my upbringing. And it's that, my mother maybe didn't use this exact language, but I think the frame that I had was that poverty can be a diversity of things. I think what we experienced was material poverty. So we maybe didn't have access to some of the materials that we needed, which meant, of course, struggling with access to food. And I saw that, recognized that, but also recognized that in other ways there was an abundance of other things. There was an abundance of joy when there was food. There was laughter, there was music, there was dancing, and that felt quite rich. So I think, in retrospect, I think capitalism has co-opted so much of what we think as in the language that we use, including how we view poverty and kind of a singular definition around poverty. So I think as a child, I recognize that some people have some things, some materials. We may not have some of those materials, but we've got some of these other things that also are a source of happiness and joy. And some folks might struggle with access to those. So I think I really benefited from a really diverse perspective on what it meant to be in poverty.
Thank you for that. And it reminds me of in Michelle Obama's book Becoming, she talks about that there was other forms of richness, and the village kind of supporting you, and other networks that people build to be able to support each other, that children benefit from, even in the context of poverty. So then during your childhood, you had all of these other forms, but then you said when you were 13 and you saw Mike Harris government and their decisions, and the way that it impacted your life. How did that feel to watch that happen, and the rhetoric that you would have seen, from Mike Harris or other people on television or the radio? Were you paying attention to that, or did it kind of just happen in your life, and you made the connection to Mike Harris later on?
Well, no, I think I was very aware of the kind of conversations. I really tuned in after that. Even more so, the kind of conversations, I remember them very clearly. I remember the Minister of Social Services at the time was someone named David Tabushi. I remember the conversations about a welfare diet and encouraging, suggesting that people could live and access the food that they need on welfare if they simply had pasta without sauce, if we went and purchased.
Sorry, what?
Yes, exactly. This was part of the welfare diet that this government was suggesting was possible. Going to the local grocery stores and accessing the dented tins. And I remember having had just learned about how important it was not to buy the dented tins. So I wouldn't use this language now, but it certainly was, I would say class warfare. It certainly was, and I saw it very clearly. Saw that there were folks in society who were being prioritized, and life was being made more easy for, and then folks like myself and the family that I grew up in, and many more across the province of Ontario, were being forced to struggle, and that struggle just increased as a result of things like that cut to welfare.
And what did you see around you in your neighborhood? Like, what did you see around you with regards to your mom's, reaction to it? There's just all different types of reactions. Sometimes it's distress. Sometimes it's working more jobs. Mom might not be as available. There's different reactions people can have. But you also see, I remember as a child, you see those reactions in your friends and their families too. So what did you observe?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know how many folks on my street, were also being raised on welfare. So I'm not sure what other folks, how other folks in my little community at the time would have responded or been affected by that decision. But what I saw was certainly more stress. Living in material poverty is a life of stress. So I was invited into, my mother's increased stress as a result of all of that. And not just the stress, but I think perhaps the fuel the fuel for my mother to have to do even more work to push back on the kind of narratives that were omnipresent, both for her and for our family, in helping me recognize as a young Black boy that I could do anything that I want to do, and be anything that I want to be, despite the narratives that were omnipresent and despite the bad-minded decisions that some of our elected officials were making at the time.
How was she able to do that? That's a really tall order when one is experiencing, like there's stress, right? Stress can be neutral. Sometimes stress is good. It's you stress, you have a deadline, it makes you do it. And then there's distress, right? Like where it is a stress that is out of your scope of control, and it actually ends up having an impact on your mental and physical health. So what you described is your mom is experiencing distress, and you're
Mhm.
seeing that vicariously, and experiencing that, but you're saying even in that condition, she is being intentional about making sure that you know that you can be anything as a Black boy. How do you want to describe how she did that, or what she was
Yeah, it's
doing
very
or
simple.
saying?
Sure, absolutely. It's very simple, and I think it's something that Black women are unfortunately tasked with all the time. And it's, pushing as being the biggest advocates of their children in a world that is unwilling to advocate for them. So, I always knew that my mother was supportive, and not just my mother, but also the community of Black women around my mother, that have long practiced mutual aid. There was a community of support there, that was like one of the most powerful things for me to experience, and one of the most inspiring ways for me to think about leadership and a commitment to community.
And in what ways was she able to advocate for you, or for the women together to be able to do that, if you reflect on it?
Yeah, I would say, making sure that teachers recognize that, like I was saying earlier, that I could do anything that I wanted to do, and that I would, you know, accomplish anything that I wanted to accomplish. I remember once I had braces as a child. I didn't wear my retainer, but I had braces as a child, and I got these braces from the University of Toronto's dentistry program. So there was a dentistry student, I'm sure supervised by somebody else, who was going through this journey with me of acquiring braces. And I remember they asked me why I wanted braces, and my mother quickly jumped in and she said, "Well, he's going to be a model." And now I had no desire to be a model, and I never had any conversation with my mother about wanting to be a model, nor had my mother shared any aspirations that she had for me to become a model. But I think it's just one of the ways that, when I reflect on that, it's my mother again challenging the low expectations and the neglect that often comes with anti-Black racism and the experience of Black folks navigating systems. As we navigate systems, in so many ways, there are things that tell us that what we're entitled to is other people's leftovers or cast-offs or second bests or bump and dent food or bump and dent whatever it is. And as an advocate, my mother refused to accept that was going to be in my mind, it was going to be in this dentist student's mind, or anybody else for that matter.
Pause. I remember when I was a kid and I came home crying, bawling, because my grade 2 teacher gave me straight D's, like D as in disappointment, on my report card, even though in grade 1, I had been an above average student. My mother was vexed. She went to the school and diplomatically cut into that teacher. My mom was like 8 months pregnant at that time. She was waddling and huffing with each step, but still went in there like Claire Huxtable and made her points clear and was like, why did my child get D's, yet I was not invited to come in for a parent-teacher meeting? Why wasn't this flagged in the progress report earlier in the year, which said Onye was performing as expected? My mom listened politely as the teacher made her excuses. Then my mom also waddled over to the principal's office and made her concerns known. Basically, long story short, she let the school know she was watching them. And she made sure my dad also met all the teachers and the principal, just to disrupt all the stereotypes. Now, that was grade 2, and by the end of grade 3, I had straight A's. This is still what parenting while Black is about, and I'm grateful my mom was my advocate, and I'm doing similar things for my sons right now. We have to advocate for Black kids. This is still a very potent antidote for anti-Black toxicity in our educational systems and beyond.
The Race, Health, and Happiness podcast will be right back after these short messages. Yeah.
The Race, Health, and Happiness podcast is produced with support from United Way Greater Toronto, whose network of agencies and initiatives in neighborhoods across the Greater Toronto area works to ensure that everyone has access to the programs and services they need to thrive today. United Way is mobilizing to tackle the unignorable issues linked to poverty.
Hi, folks. We will get back to this episode of Race, Health, and Happiness in just a moment. It is such a privilege to be able to have these types of conversations with amazing guests like Paul Taylor. But it's also so rewarding to be able to use the podcast to support the careers of Black and BIPOC journalism students. Dr. Carl and I do this podcast as volunteer work, as a creative expression of our love for community. But we do have students. Right now, we have 2 Black female journalism students on our team who work very hard on this show, and we make it a point to pay them. If you listen to the Camille Dundas episode, or if you know anything about media, Black women are not always given the same opportunities. And personally, I'll be damned if I'm going to make these students work so hard for free. So we apply for grants to pay our interns, but when we are between grants, we're trying to make sure we have the funds to ensure that they are okay. So I just want to encourage you, all of you, if you are able, please go to our Patreon page and make whatever contribution you can. We appreciate you. If you are enjoying this show, please walk your talk and make a contribution at patreon.com/RaceHealth&Happy. That's patreon.com/RaceHealth&Happy, and help support our students today. The link is also in the show notes.
As we navigate systems, in so many ways, there are things that tell us that what we're entitled to is other people's leftovers or cast-offs or second bests or bump and dent food or bump and dent whatever it is. And as an advocate, my mother refused to accept that was going to be in my mind, it was going to be in this dentist student's mind, or anybody else for that matter.
I love that. And I think I join you, like my mother, would do the same thing. And so I was curious about that kind of story, right? Because it often happens to all of us or many of us that our mothers have had to go to school and, speak on our behalf or in other spaces. I do love the fact that you said you were a model, though, because, I certainly chose you as a guest because I see you as a model, a role model. So she was speaking it into the universe, maybe beyond what you could imagine. So gratitude to her. And so you were learning about advocacy at that young age through your mom. Do you remember, I know that you've spoken also, for you becoming an advocate and an activist, I imagine your mom had an influence on that, but I know that at some point in your life, learning about the labor movement also impacted your decision to become an activist.
Mm.
How did that come about?
Yeah, so I had a job placement, got a scholarship that placed me with a trade union working at their national office. And I think it was another opportunity for me to engage in kind of conversations about the systems that affect the lives of everyday people, in particular, the lives of those who our systems make the most vulnerable. So I was able to spend time on picket lines. I spent time with rank and file union members, talking about the issues that were relevant to them and pushing back on the ways in which I think capitalism was really advancing the exploitation of so many of these workers. So I think for me, I recognize that, there are other people out there that want to see change and are willing to roll up their sleeves and push back on things that many of us are not curious about or don't seize opportunity to push back or dream about in other ways. So that for me was very enlightening and really helped set me on a path of organizing, I would say. It's those experiences connected to, I think something I spoke about a little bit earlier, but the commitment to community that was taught to me by, women like my great-grandmother. Or my grandmother, Maisie Olivia Baker Burt, who, was an advocate in her own way and made sure that the kids in her community, although she didn't have a lot, that they had access to the food that they needed. So she would, cook up the very little that she had, and kids would be lined up out front of her place for a bite to eat. And I think it was her sure, it was mutual aid, but I think it was also her stepping into and allowing herself to dream about the possibility for all of these young Black kids. So I think that for me has been an inspiration in allowing me to also, and inspiring me to step into a world of possibility for all of us, particularly those who our systems have made most vulnerable.
I think so. I am now curious about how you foster this nature of possibility, because for all of the experiences that you have said, there are one could go the other way. One could kind of shut in more, right? When you talk, so, for instance, again, I'll give my example. I remember when I was around the same age, you mentioned 12 when Mike Harris government came in. I was around the age of, I'm pretty sure it was 14 or 15 in Quebec. I grew up in Quebec when the Quebec government said, when they lost the election, the referendum to separate, and Parizeau, who was the politician at that time, came on the podium and said, "C'est à cause des ethniques," right? It's because of the ethnic people, and everybody started to boo in the crowd. And so I remember in that moment, because it was like the day before Halloween or something, but I remember that moment being like, I'm never going to belong here. And so my identity is not Quebecois or Canadian. Like, I shut in. You know what I mean? I was like, I'm Nigerian, I'm Trinidadian. That's it. Doesn't matter if I was born here, I'm not going to belong. That shifted over time, but in that moment I shut in. But what you're describing is, the opposite, basically. Like, you saw what the Mike Harris government, the pain that it caused your family. You entered the labor, the union environment, which has largely historically been exclusionary to non-white males. Basically, I don't even want to say racialized, like just basically anybody who's not a white male, but still found inspiration there. Does that come from your grandmother? Like, where, or is it faith? Like, where for you does the ability to kind of filter through and find the possibilities come from?
In relation to those spaces, I think it comes back again to my mother being an advocate. She really taught me that I belong in any space that I want to be in. And if somebody doesn't like that, they're more than welcome to find a different space for themselves to occupy. So,
hey, I like it. Say it again.
I belong anywhere and everywhere. So I have really fortunately taken that lesson with me and recognized that when people are uncomfortable with my presence, well, they have options that they can exercise. They can exit those spaces. So I assume that when people have that kind of discomfort, that they will exit those spaces and do what they need to do for themselves. But I'm not going anywhere unless I decide that it's time for me to exit. So that's just my view as I enter these spaces that folks would perhaps rather me not be there. And I also think that as I've gotten older and entered in more and more of these spaces, I've, learned to develop strategies, because I know that other folks perhaps haven't had those lessons and haven't felt like they can be in all of those spaces and deserve to be in these spaces. We hear about this nonsense about imposter syndrome. I think it's absolute nonsense. It is white supremacy. It is patriarchy. It is all of those systems that tell us that we don't belong. It's not about us necessarily. So I think it's been really helpful to also develop strategies with other folks around how to be in those spaces in safe ways when folks are feeling vulnerable. Where do we sit? How do we voice our feelings about an issue? Are we caucusing? Are we caucusing in advance of the gathering, after the gathering, to make sure that everyone is okay after that experience?
Pause. Paul just dropped some serious knowledge. Did you catch it? Caucusing is a potent prescription for resisting racism and staying well while you do it. In this case, we're talking about a Black caucus. As Paul describes it, it's where a group of Black or BIPOC folks come together as a group, sometimes organically Or, most recently, sometimes it's organized by an institution in an effort to dismantle the systemic racism within the organization. Either way, it's done with intentionality, and it's to enable Black folks to share their experiences of racism openly and discuss plans to either address it or just receive validation from peers. For Paul, these meetings can take place to strategize before or after a meeting, or just to debrief, just laugh, or vent. This is a practice I'm very intentional about in my own life, and you should consider doing this too.
I've, learned to develop strategies because I know that other folks perhaps haven't had those lessons and haven't felt like they can be in all of those spaces and deserve to be in these spaces. We hear about this nonsense about imposter syndrome. I think it's absolute nonsense. It is white supremacy. It is patriarchy. It is all of those systems that tell us that we don't belong. It's not about us necessarily. I think it's been really helpful to also develop strategies with other folks around how to be in those spaces in safe ways when folks are feeling vulnerable. Where do we sit? How do we voice our feelings about an issue? Are we caucusing? Are we caucusing in advance of the gathering, after the gathering, to make sure that everyone is okay after that experience? I think those are all the types of things, which ultimately are extra labor, all the extra labor that come with being someone that's Black, that's queer, that's not often invited into spaces, especially spaces where people wield a significant amount of power.
And so I'm going to touch on what you had just mentioned with regards to patriarchy. So you mentioned patriarchy and our systemically racist system, and then being Black and queer, which is an intersectional space as a Black man that can also, create violence even within Black communities, right? So for those who are not part of Black communities, it can result in greater marginalization. Can you speak a little bit to that? And still, as you said, being like, I come into this space and you can move if you like. What have been your experiences with regards to that intersectional aspect of your identity?
I would say the exact same. I've been very fortunate to have been taught that, I belong in the spaces. My opinions matter. If folks are discussing things that affect me, affect others, affect people that look like me, affect people that have experiences like mine, that I need to be in that space. They forgot to invite me, and I need to be in that space to make sure.
I love that they forgot to. You forgot to send me the invitation. That's okay. I'm here anyway. Is that
absolutely,
basically? Okay.
Absolutely, and I will be generous with offering my feedback on what we're discussing. So I think that's always been my approach. I recognize that's not been everyone's approach, and that's not been everyone's experience, but it's been mine to a large extent, and I'm very fortunate to have had that experience to have been inspired and taught that way, because it has allowed me to navigate some spaces that had I not been taught that I belong there, that I probably would have second guessed myself, or maybe not engage in those spaces as spaces at all. So.
Okay. But yeah, I love that. You forgot to invite me, but I'm here. I love that. One other thing, we're just going to rewind, because you mentioned caucusing, which I thought is really cool, because we have to be in the spaces with intentionality. And you said, do we have to caucus before or after? Can you kind of define and unpack that? What does that mean as you do that?
For me, I think about working in the sector that I work in that is dominated by white women. I think, to be a Black person in those spaces exposes one to, some microaggressions, violence, and our experience of those things is not usually prioritized, centered, spoken about, addressed, protected against. So again, that additional labor of having to find ways to engage in those spaces and building community with other Black folks and even some non-Black racialized folks working in this space, to be able to just sometimes have a good kiki and a good laugh about how silly sometimes and white folks can be when they forget to invite us, or when they are as harmful as they can be and as harmful as our systems are as we navigate them. I've just found it so helpful to be able to connect with other folks working particularly in the food insecurity space, but working and connecting with folks working in that space to build community and just say, you're experiencing the same thing too. Yeah. And that sort of thing. In caucusing in those types of spaces, one thing that I'm mindful of is that often my colleagues that I'm with are folks that might work in another organization, but they don't have the same power that I might have in the organization that I work in as the executive director. So I'm mindful of that, and I recognize that it's much harder for my board of directors to fire me than it is somebody working somewhere else that's maybe precariously employed on contract, doesn't have benefits and that sort of thing. So I can be more of a shit disturber, and I can, and maybe part of it is my personality, but I can be more curious and publicly curious than I think folks who are more precarious. So I think caucusing is great, and I take a lot from that, but I also bring to those experiences, a responsibility based on the position and the power that I occupy.
I think that is so powerful. It's, again, thinking intentionally about connecting with Black or BIPOC folks to validate each other's experiences and perhaps engage in planning. And like you said, being intentional about your power and privilege to, be a voice or amplify the voices in that space. And so, yeah, even for, within Black Physicians Association, when we've done our surveys, although there's very few, we're usually underrepresented. A lot that came out is that people they didn't use the word caucusing, but certainly finding solidarity with, Black nurses, environmental workers in the hospital, other, regardless of roles or the silly hierarchies, it's that lived experience and connecting on that. But I think you thinking about your positionality in that is also very, very powerful. But let's jump into, actually, you mentioned your industry. So let's talk about your work in with FoodShare, but specifically, you folks are the largest food security organization, and I read that you said food insecurity actually has very little to do with food, and I thought that was it made me curious. So, do you kind of want to speak about that with regards to, your thoughts on defining, or how you define food security or food insecurity?
Okay, and I think that's such an important question that rarely gets asked. And maybe I will start, and it's important to ask that question and to talk about it, I think, because it's a term that's been poorly understood, I think. So I'm going to take a step back, and I sometimes I find it better to start with what food security isn't. And I'm going to contrast it to hunger, because I think many people use these terms interchangeably, and they are very different. Hunger is something that's measured on the individual level, and can be caused by food insecurity, but it can also be caused by, I was making pizza and I burnt my pizza, and now I have to wait another half an hour or 45 minutes for the actual dinner that I'm going to have now to be ready, so I'm hungry. That is something, again, on the individual level. When we talk about food insecurity, it's something that's measured at the household level, and it's really about not being able to access a sufficient quality of nutritious food, primarily due to a lack of income. And that's often where the definitions of food insecurity, end. It's about income, and we talk a lot about how important it is to focus on income-based interventions. But I think it's important for those definitions of food insecurity to go a little bit further and, understand who in society has been allowed to access more income than others, and trace back the root of that lack of income to things like anti-Black racism, anti-indigeneity, ableism, patriarchy, classism, all of those sorts of things, because those are often not a part of the conversations about food insecurity. But ultimately, food insecurity is largely an issue based on income. And I think it's really important to say that, because also we produce more than enough food that we need, that more than enough
Yes.
food than we need in this country. It's not that we don't have enough peanut butter, Kraft dinner, tins of tuna, or corporate waste. Um, uh, that's not a solution. I think we've created, as our default response to food insecurity, other people's leftovers. And all that does is tell people that are interacting with systems that cause them to experience poverty and food insecurity, just tells them that society thinks of them as walking compost bins. So the way that we've understood this issue is so problematic. And if I can add one other key piece, that again is often not connected with conversations around food insecurity and how we respond, is that, in this country since 1976, Canadians have had a right to food. Why aren't we learning about that in classrooms? We're learning about donating to food banks and food drives, and how that's an important part of being a good person. But I think an important part of being an engaged citizen is recognizing what our rights and entitlements are and what responsibilities come with those things. So we have a right to food. The federal government in 1976 ratified the right to food, which means that they are the duty bearer. We're the rights holders, and it means that they have an obligation to create the conditions to allow us to access the food that we need. But unfortunately, this international covenant exists over here, while the reality is that food has been made a commodity, and we live in a highly corporatized system designed to extract the most amount of profit possible. So these tensions really can't exist, and it requires kind of government responsibility around public policy to address and to advance the progressive realization of the right to food.
And I think about this issue and the right to food and what you had said about it being about income, and that, I also know in this country, and of course North America, poverty is racialized. So how, what I don't know if you've looked at the research or your lived experiences, like what are the implications on the ground, where we see that the poverty is racialized and then the access to food is racialized, and the right to food is ignored for those who are racialized? What does that mean for our everyday lives?
Also a good question. I appreciate you asking that. I would say, again, occupational hazard, so bear with me here. But I will
It's okay,
give
go on.
the high level, simple answer first, and it's that anti-Black racism is a cause of food insecurity in Canada. And like I said, it's never really been a part of the discussion, which means that it's never really been connected. The two have never really been connected in spaces that are resourced to find solutions. So, it's interesting because folks in Black communities know this, but we're rarely resourced to lead and to develop the solutions on these issues like food insecurity and poverty that have been bestowed upon us. And I think, we look at how that plays out, and we just need to look at who our policymakers are, or who typically leads organizations working on food insecurity. It's not us. Despite the fact that 36% of Black children live in food insecure households versus 12% of their white counterparts, despite the fact that Black households are 3.5 times more likely to be food insecure, or to experience food insecurity than white households are. It's so incredibly insidious. And I'd like to paint a little picture of this, if I may.
Yes,
And I want to acknowledge that, some of what I share and some of the data that I just shared, that comes from a partnership that FoodShare, where I work, engaged in. We partnered with an organization called Proof out of the University of Toronto. That's an interdisciplinary research group. And we looked at data that exists and has long existed, but we found has never been analyzed or reported out on. So we looked at the Canadian Community Health Survey data from 2005 to 2014 to get a better sense of food insecurity for Black Canadians, and it painted such a terrible picture of anti-Black racism in this country, but also a very clear picture. And again, things that had never been acknowledged in conversations about food insecurity in this country. So just to share a few, if I may.
Please do, yeah.
So so when we talk about food insecurity, and as you know, to be quite frank, white leaders have talked about food insecurity in this country. They've relied on aggregate data. So they've made assertions like household composition is a key driver of food insecurity. If you live in a single parent household, you're more likely to be in a food insecure household. Well, what we found is that for Black Canadians, it didn't matter if it was a single parent household or a dual parent household. The risk and prevalence of food insecurity was high. The same was true in terms of challenging those narratives that had been long held around immigration status. It didn't matter whether a Black person was born here, born abroad, lived here for 20 or 30 years. The risk and prevalence of food insecurity remained high. I'll share maybe one other piece. There were so many of these things, but it was around social assistance. We found that through looking at this research, although most people who are food insecure do not rely on social assistance, they rely on income that they receive from paid work. There is a portion of people that are on social assistance that are food insecure. And we found that white Canadians receive more money in social assistance than Black Canadians do. And we had no idea why at first that was until we realized that those calculations also include disability income supports. So what that's telling us is that white folks are more likely to be approved for disability, which means they get more money in support. And when they are approved for disability, they're approved for more money.
Pause. Paul said Black patients are less likely to receive disability benefits. In the province of Ontario, this program provides people extra income when they're unemployed and have a qualifying medical condition. In my experience with my patients, there are two main obstacles that prevent Black patients from successfully getting disability benefits. One obvious barrier is that in order to get these benefits, you have to know about the program and know how to obtain the forms. And I think there was a disparity in Black patients getting that information. The second barrier was that I observed Black patients' refusal to apply for disability benefits due to stigma. Now, I didn't see this in all of my Black patients, but I did notice it was as if there was a level of discomfort from the word disability in the disability program. So what do? Well, to deal with the awareness problem, I think healthcare providers need to do a better job of informing racialized patients of benefits like these. And to address the shame around the word disability in our communities, we all have to play a role in destigmatizing it too. Let's face it, being Black is a full-time job on its own. So we have earned those benefits. If you need them, you should use them. As Paul's data shows, it can really make a difference.
We found that through looking at this research, although most people who are food insecure do not rely on social assistance, they rely on income that they receive from paid work. There is a portion of people that are on social assistance that are food insecure. And we found that white Canadians receive more money in social assistance than Black Canadians do. And we had no idea why at first that was until we realized that those calculations also include disability income supports. So what that's telling us is that white folks are more likely to be approved for disability, which means they get more money in support. And when they are approved for disability, they're approved for more money. So ultimately, while that data was novel and did, I think, identify some specific systemic and institutional failures for Black Canadians, to be honest, it confirmed what many of us had already long known. And it's that white supremacy and anti-Black racism are alive and well in all of our systems, institutions, and public policies.
That just blew my mind, but it's consistent with what I guess I already know, but you just kind of laid it out very clearly. Like basically all of those different variables that we hear about or factors that play a role, I guess if you're a white person or a white woman who's a single mother, all of those are kind of neutralized just by being Black. Basically, whether you're, like you said, whether you're born here, single parent, this, that, all of the being Black, basically, because of anti-Black racism. Which makes me then, but you said there's been so few of us as leaders. So I'm wondering about, like, yes, you've done this research, but you are the executive director of FoodShare. And so do you want to talk about that and the work that you do around advocacy within FoodShare and beyond FoodShare, but you want to talk about the work that you're doing around food security?
For sure. So I would say, FoodShare, we describe ourselves as a food justice organization. And I guess the best way to put it, there's no elevator pitch for FoodShare. I feel like we do way too much. But I guess the best way to put it is we have a bit of a threefold approach. So the first I would say is we support access to fresh produce through things like social enterprises, like our Good Food Box. We have this box, someone can place an order, it gets delivered to their home, fresh produce.
I get it. I love it.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. And don't forget during the growing season to order the Dismantling White Supremacy Good Food Box.
Okay.
We have a produce box that's grown exclusively by Black, Indigenous, and other racialized growers or farms owned by the same folks. So you can imagine the phone calls and emails I got when we introduced the Dismantling White Supremacy Good Food Box. But that's maybe a story for another day.
I love that. Thank you for mentioning that. Please go on. But yes, I will get it.
No problem. And, we also work with communities that have been chronically underinvested in. And we work with those communities to build. And also, one of the ways in which I talk a lot about capitalism, one of the ways that we're challenging capitalism and the commodification of food is we work with folks in those communities that have been chronically underinvested in to build community-led food infrastructure. So when I say that, I'm talking about things like markets, subsidized produce markets. We've helped develop 50 of them across the city. We call them good food markets. We've developed urban farms, so transitioned underutilized public land and converted those into farms in communities. Again, it's the same types of communities, and have built produce markets in front of those farms so that folks can have the farmers market experience, can access local food, and so that farmers markets aren't just for the palest among us. And then lastly, I would say we seize opportunities for public education and advocacy around the issue of food insecurity and helping people recognize again that it's not going to be solved by community gardens. It's not going to be solved by Starbucks day-old muffins, and really point to the policy type interventions that are required.
I think it's so important. You mentioned that we need to be leaders in the space, and you mentioned the phenomenal work that you're doing at FoodShare, but then you went into politics. And so was it the experience working in this field or other factors that led you, to run for office?
Yeah, I would say a couple of things. One, first and foremost, it's the systemic nature of the issues of poverty and food insecurity. They will not be solved by community organizations. It will not be solved by charity, ultimately. So the tools to solve issues like poverty and food insecurity that matter so much to me are really available to our governments, and we need government leadership on addressing these issues. I would add, though, I think an undervalued part of politics is the critical constituency work that happens locally when you're supporting people through really critical and important times in their lives. That is important advocacy, that's important community work. And I think, again, it's often not what's celebrated in the same way that, the people that when they're yelling in the House of Commons is celebrated. But constituency work is key. And then ultimately also a belief that better is possible. I'm ultimately an optimist, so I do believe that better is possible. And folks who aren't willing to work for better need to, I think, step aside and let folks that will work for better occupy those seats.
I think that is exactly what we should all be thinking about. I think some of us disengage from politics and become cynical, and I love that you have that optimism and thinking about the possibilities. So thank you so much for all of the different advice and gifts and insights that you've shared with us. You do a lot of work. And so I want to ask you, along with all the work, which I presume brings you joy, but aside from work, what brings you joy?
Oh, well, I have to say, rest, peace, and play all bring me joy. And I think about, actually, this is really important for me, because these are things that many of my ancestors either fought for or had stolen from them completely, often as a result of the same kind of oppressive organizing principles that's taking food out of Black Canadians' mouths. So in the last couple of years, I've really been reflecting on why it is that those who came before me have fought and took the incredible risks that they did. And certainly it was for justice in the face of injustice, but why? And I think it's so that they could thrive, so that they could enjoy rest, peace, and play. And those are things, that capitalism doesn't teach us to value. So it takes me a lot to push back in my own way and hold on to those dreams and hopes of my ancestors. And I'll just end with, I read a really great article, really inspired me yesterday, and it got me thinking. It talked about coffee and coffee being a tool of capitalism. Many of us use it to work longer and to be more productive. And we do this, and often doing this while we compromise our rest. So it got me thinking about how coffee is practically available on every street corner, and it goes unquestioned and celebrated by folks who live in those communities. And then I contrast that, to the long battle to have things like marijuana legalized. I don't ever hear someone say that, man, that was a great joint. I'm going to go back and sit in my cubicle and bang out the best Q3 analysis report my boss has ever seen. So I think it's really important to reflect on these sorts of things and ask ourselves why, and of course, who has been prioritized and allowed to benefit the most, and make sure that we're leaning into opportunities to rest, deep rest, eat good food, have joy, and play outside.
I love it. Rest, peace, and play. I need to get down with RPP now. I like that. Thank you for that gift. Thank you for taking time out of your day to speak with us. And like I said, I repeat, your mama was right. You are a model. Oh. And so we thank you.
Thank you, Dr. O. This has been such a pleasure.
The Race, Health, and Happiness podcast was created by Dr. Onye Norum, and she's our host. The show is produced, edited, and engineered by yours truly, Dr. Carl Cabasel. Our technical producer is Obadiah George. Our showrunner is Cam, and JL Joseph is associate producer. Promotions coordinator is Jordan Gibson. Social media coordinator is Efwa Mfojo. And Javiera Gutierrez Duran is our logistics coordinator. Awit Siem is our business manager, and Tamika E. Latibaudiere is our research consultant. Additional support from Latoya Powell, our special production consultant. The RHH theme song is composed and performed by Gold Keys. That's Gold Keys, all one word, ending with a Z. And graphic design is handled by Veronica Ng. Do you have questions, feedback, ideas to share? We would love to hear from you. You can connect with us on Instagram and Twitter at RaceHealth&Happy, and check out the show notes for research that was referenced in this episode, as well as other bonus material. Our website is RaceHealth&Happiness.com. Thank you for listening to Race, Health, and Happiness, and please subscribe to us anywhere you get your favorite podcasts. I'm Dr. Carl Cabasel, and we'll talk with you soon.
The Race, Health, and Happiness podcast is brought to you through the generous sponsorship of United Way Greater Toronto, with help from University X, the school formerly known as Ryerson, and with support from subscribers and listeners like you. Donate today at patreon.com/RaceHealth&Happy. We appreciate your support. The Race, Health and Happiness podcast is made better by the skills, knowledge, and creative passion of the journalism students who work right here on the show. These students join us from University X, the school formerly known as Ryerson. Thank you for the hard work. We appreciate you. Yeah.